Okay, colleagues, I've just started the webinar now and the recording is on. So we're waiting participants to join. I'm going to start sharing presentation. Welcome to all the colleagues who have joined. We're going to give the rest of the participants a few more minutes to join before we begin. Welcome to all the panelists and to the viewers. We're going to give participants a few more minutes to join. It is on top of the hour on our clock. Give the participants perhaps another 2 more minutes to join before we begin the webinar. Thank you. All right, by my clock, it is 2 minutes past the hour. We'd like to then begin the webinar. So welcome to this webinar, which is hosted by Vera. The topic of this webinar is the August 2023 VCS Program updates, an overview for validation and verification bodies using the acronym VVBs. All right, so as we begin, we're going to start with a few housekeeping rules. Kindly note that this webinar is being recorded, therefore your continued participation is consent to being recorded. The recording will be shared with all registrants to the webinar post the webinar. We have muted all microphones of attendees, but we welcome your engagement through questions posted to the Q&A function. Allow me to introduce to you the presenters for this webinar. From left to right, we have Janice, who's Director of Auditing and Accreditation. Then we have Nicole, which is Manager VCS Program Development. Next, we have Candice, which is Senior Director, Nature-Based Innovation. And on the right-hand side, we have Anna, who is Senior Program Officer, VCS Program Development. The objective of the webinar are listed here. So firstly, to provide an overview of the August 2023 VCS program updates. It is important to note that the scope of today's webinar is to present the key VCS updates, which include the VCS standard, the VCS program guide, and the RIP, the registration and issuance process, with specific relevance to VVBs. But note, this is not an exhaustive review of all updates. VVBs must review all updates and ensure information is cascaded or shared with all relevant VVB staff and auditors. What is specifically not covered in the scope of this webinar today are any updates related to VCS methodology requirements version 4.4. There have been some VVB specific updates to the methodology requirements, so VVBs are encouraged to familiarize themselves with those updates. Whilst we will attempt to address all relevant questions raised during the Q&A session, kindly note that we have enabled an upvote function in the Q&A where you can upvote questions you feel are most pertinent, and we will address these first. Questions not addressed on today's webinar will be sent, can be sent to the appropriate Vera contact details that are displayed now on the screen. So questions that are specific to VCS program update questions, these can be forwarded to programupdates@vera.org. Questions related to the general VCS program can be sent to info@vera.org, and questions which are related to auditing and accreditation can be sent to auditing@vera.org. So in terms of the agenda, we will begin with an introduction to the August 2023 VCS program updates. We will provide an overview of the updates and explain the relevance thereof to the VVBs. Then we'll have the presenters to address the updates in a chronological order according to their effective dates, beginning with those which are effective immediately, followed by those that are effective as of January the 1st, 2024, next year. And finally, we'll address those that are effective, the updates that are effective as of the 1st of March, 2024. We encourage viewers to follow along in the summary of effective dates document. You can follow the update ID number as we discuss them individually. The VCS program effective dates document can be found on our website, and a QR code, which will be displayed shortly, can also be scanned to gain access to the document. As indicated, we will have a Q&A session. The Q&A session will be shared publicly, and participants can view all submitted questions and can upvote the ones they want to be answered first, or most pressing question. We ask participants to please be respectful and not to put anything inappropriate in the Q&A, and also we ask that questions be related specifically to updates and not with specific projects. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Nicole, to take us through the first section. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Leo. As Leo introduced me, I'm Nicole, Manager of VCS Program Development. I will give us a very brief introduction to the overall August 2023 VCS program updates. As you can see here, the first thing we want to do is share some great appreciation for stakeholder input all of the VCS program updates were very extensive. They were drawn from a lot of different sources. And a lot of the input that we received over these consultations in the last year or so really helped us throughout the development process of these updates. As I mentioned, there are quite a lot of updates in this round. All of them are listed in this helpful document here, the overview and effective dates document, which we usually refer to shorthand as just the effective dates document. And as Leo mentioned, they're all listed here in order of first appearance in the VCS program documents. They have a unique ID number assigned to them. So you can see that ID number in the effective dates document, and that same ID number for each update will correspond in the appendices of the relevant program documents in the document history appendices. So that will be a helpful resource for you to follow along which updates we are talking about. All of the affected program documents that were updated are available on the VCS rules and requirements page. So we recommend that you use that as your resource to find the most updated VCS program documents. Next slide. As Leah mentioned, this is where you can access the effective dates document, which will be a really helpful resource for you to follow along. You can use the QR code now, or you can enter this URL into your browser. And this leads us to the most recent version of the effective dates document. Please note that this was updated most recently on the 25th of September to correspond with the recent correction and clarification document that Vera issued in relation to some effective dates of some program updates. Next slide. This slide provides a little bit more information in general about effective dates and how they should be interpreted. This same text is at the top of the effective dates document. Effective immediately means that the update applies to all project requests submitted on or after the release date of the 29th of August, 2023. We've had a lot of questions about what all project requests refers to. And this does refer to any project request submitted to the Vera registry. That includes pipeline listing requests, project registration requests, crediting period renewal requests, you name it. For updates that are not effective immediately, project proponents, they can choose at any time to conform with updated requirements before the effective date, if they would like to do so. And if they do make such updates ahead of the effective date, the VVB is expected to also validate or verify the project in accordance with those updated requirements. Now that I've spent a little bit of time introducing the program updates, I'll pass it along to my colleague Anna to talk about updates which are effective immediately.
Thanks, Nicole. Next slide, please, Leo. So first, we wanted to highlight we're not noted in the specific updates we'll cover in today's webinar. Here is a list of other program definition updates. While VVBs are expected to familiarize themselves with all program updates, including definitions, this slide provides a snapshot of updated, new, changed, clarified definitions that are not covered in the other slides today. See the individual effective dates in the overview of program updates and effective dates document to see the corresponding changes and effective dates for each of these definitions. I'm going to now turn it over to Janice to talk about VVB program eligibility.
Great, thank you. Yes, so update ID number 4 is about VVB program eligibility requirements, and this is applied in the VCS Program Guide 4.4 Section 5. So there's just been very subtle but important updates to note here, pointing out that accreditation bodies that Vera is now engaging with, VVBs must be getting accredited by an accreditation body that's an IAF MLA member under ISO 17029-14065. And they have to have the MLA multilateral recognition arrangement specifically under scope 17029, 14065, which is the greenhouse gas validation and verification scope. Secondly, we wanted to point out that an update that it's important where VVBs highlight they can only conduct validation and verifications for sectoral scopes for which they hold the underlying accreditation by either an IAF-MLA accreditation body or UNFCCC for those that are still having extensions of their UNFCCC accreditation as they're pursuing their IAF-MLA. The VCS program guide does state that VVBs can only do validations and verifications for projects for which they have that scope of accreditation in addition to VERA approval. And approvals granted by VERA to conduct work under VERA's sectoral scopes are granted solely on the underlying accreditation scopes. So really, what this means for VVBs is that VERA can have some combined multiple project activities, for example, under both under the AFULU scope. Some of them may require agricultural accreditation scopes, and some require afforestation or reforestation accreditation scopes, and some methodologies require both the underlying agriculture and accreditation scopes. Next slide, please. Okay, so just flesh this out a little bit more in terms of what it means for VVBs. Really, whoops, sorry. Wrong slide on my part. So what this means for VVBs approved for VERA, I'm going to give this as an example, for VERA Scope 14 AFULU. VVBs that have VERA approved Scope 14 may not be able to do any kind of AFULU project validation or verification. VVBs must first check their underlying ISO or CDM accreditation scope against the methodology that the project is using. A VVB could get VERA approval for AFULU Scope 14 having one of three following underlying accreditations. They could have, an ISO or UNFCCC Scope 14 afforestation reforestation, or they could have the ISO or UNFCCC Scope 15 agriculture, or they could have a corresponding similar AFULU scope. For example, ANAB, one of the accreditation bodies, actually has a defined Scope 3 called Land Use and Forestry, and that's the equivalent of an agricultural scope. So they've combined on their end providing agriculture and forestry together under one land use and forestry scope. So to show this a little bit more using VM42 as an example of where a VVB may or may not be able to actually audit a project. VERA AFULU has categories underneath and is defined in Appendix A of the VCS standard for agricultural land management, for forestry, for RED projects, also WRC and some other land uses. But that doesn't mean that a VVB that's approved by VERA for AFULU scope can do all of those types of activities under AFULU due to limitations of the VVB's fundamental accreditation scope. In each methodology, you will be able to see in section 2 what the specific scope of that methodology is. So VM42 is clearly defined in section 2 as an agricultural land management methodology. So the question would be which VVBs with VERA approval for AFULU scope may not be able to conduct audits to projects using VM42. And in this case, it would be an accreditation body that only had, a VVB that only has an underlying accreditation of afforestation and reforestation scope 14. And why is that? That's because the VVB does have VERA AFULU scope approval, but they do not have an underlying accreditation scope for agricultural project work. And the methodology is clearly for agricultural land management projects. Great. Next slide, please. I'll hand it over to Anna to discuss this slide.
Thanks, Janice. So we've made some slight edits to the VVB site visit requirements. First, we've clarified that validation means a site visit that includes a visit to facilities which applies at project crediting period renewal, not just initial validation. We've also clarified procedures for when a VVB site visit occurs prior to the end of the monitoring period, which states that VVB shall verify the volume of reductions and removals generated between the site visit and the end of the monitoring period, and describe the additional evidence gathering activities conducted. This is effective immediately for projects that initiate validation and/or verification after 29 August 2023, and then also for projects effective immediately, which initiate the verification process after 29 August 2023. I'll turn it back over to you, Janice.
Great. So yeah, what does this mean for VVBs? It's fairly straightforward, but we want to point out VVBs need to ensure that they plan for mandatory site visits that include visits to project areas and facilities, not just for the initial validation, but for crediting period renewal validations. So reminder, VVBs check the rules for site visits in section 4 of the VCS standard. Verification audits and VVB statements of opinions, because they provide assurance on emission reductions for the entire crediting period as having already taken place. Site visits and audits could not take place prior to the end of the monitoring period. However, we do recognize that there are some situations where the site visit does take place prior to the end of the monitoring period, and we're not saying that that's a rule violation, but it really should be in exceptional cases only where that does happen. And when that does happen, there is this gap period between, verifying in reality at the site visit the emission reductions that have occurred, and then there's a period before the end of the monitoring period where those emission reductions need to be verified separately. And the VVBs must describe in the verification report how they assess that gap period emission reductions, and we're able to provide a reasonable level of assurance on those gap period emission reductions. Because VVB assessments of gap periods, of a gap period, it can't happen in reality to verify something that hasn't yet taken place. So VVB should also never be issuing a final verification report or a statement of opinion until after the monitoring period has ended. A VVB can conduct audit activities to assess the gap period only after it's actually taken place. So Vera should never receive an issuance report from a project proponent that's been issued a verification report before the end of the monitoring period. Back over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Janice. So we've also clarified our requirements around VVB rotation. First, we've clarified that the validation verification body rotation requirements have been changed to where the same VVB cannot verify the last monitoring period of the crediting period, do the crediting period renewal validation, and verify the first monitoring period in the next crediting period. We have also, the other original VVB rotation rules still apply. This is the only change made. This is effective immediately for projects that initiate validation and/or verification after 29 August 2023. Back to you, Janice.
Great. So what does this mean for VVBs? We hope to have clarified here when the same VVB can do the final verification of a crediting period and crediting period renewal validation at the same time or separately, or when the same VVB can do a crediting period renewal validation and the final verification of a crediting period at the same time or separately. So hopefully this is going to clarify things. So the first example here is where VVB A did not complete the final verification of crediting period 1, we'll call it. VVB A can do the crediting period renewal validation and the first verification of crediting period 2. They can do those again as a joint assessment, or they can do them as separate engagements. But VVB A cannot do the verification 2 of that crediting period. A separate, different VVB must do that. In the second example, we're saying VVB A can do a crediting period renewal validation and the final verification of that crediting period, where that VVB isn't exceeding verifying more than 6 years emission reductions, and VVBA cannot then do the verification, the second verification of that crediting period, the new crediting period. A separate VVB must then do that. So in short, VVB rotation rules, the 6 years max crediting period exception of a FULO project should still be adhered to, must still be met. And where VVBs have done 6 years verifications of emission reductions, they cannot do any other verification until after 3 years emission reductions are verified by another VVB. And hopefully this update and clarification in the rules will give more clarity around, doing the combined crediting period renewal validations in the final or the first verification afterwards. Next slide, please. And back to you, Anna. Actually, I think the next slide is for me as well. So next slide. Okay, just a quick update. We've added an update to the VCS program guide, and this is the corresponding update in the VCS program fee schedule about VVB oversight and sanctions procedures. So we've just added in some additional information about VERA's role in overseeing validation and verification body performance. And then we've added a whole new section on actual sanctions of validation and verification bodies in the cases of poor performance and or non-conformance with VERA rules. We've also published a new fee schedule that includes a fee for suspension, reinstatement of VVBs that get suspended. So this means basically that VERA now, the clarification means VERA may conduct VVB reviews, and where shortcomings are identified, VERA will provide feedback. We may require the VVB to address nonconformities and we will report VVB performance to the respective accreditation bodies. And also in the cases of VVB poor performance or continued non-conformance with program rules, VERA may implement sanctions. If the sanctions result in the suspension of a VVB for poor performance, there is a reinstatement fee now that is published in the fee schedule. Sorry, next slide. That's basically a summary of everything that I just stated there. And we did do a comprehensive webinar in August of this year on an introduction to the performance monitoring program for VVBs. So the recording of the session, there's a link here that's been provided. We also have sent that out to all VVBs that attended the session. If you were not able to attend and you do want access to the webinar, please reach out to Auditing and Accreditation, and we will make sure that you can access that. Next slide, please. And over to you, Anna, for this slide.
Thanks, Janice. So we have updated and streamlined the review procedure in section 4.3 of the RIP, most of the registration and issuance process. Most importantly, we've included a procedure for denials of requests and subsequent rejection or inactivation for projects. It's important to note that registration requests can only be denied twice, and the second request must be submitted within 1 year of the date of denial. Failure to do so will result in a project rejection, as well as the second request denial. Crediting period renewals can also only be denied twice, with the same stipulation that the second request must be submitted 1 year of the date of denial, or the project will become inactive. The VERA registry statuses will be updated to reflect these processes soon, but currently are not. And there are no specific conditions for verification requests, so verification requests could be denied multiple times. Next slide, please. Think back to you, Janice.
Great, thank you. So what does this mean for VVBs? The project denial process now is one of the, it factors into the VVB performance tracking. So in situations where it's considered part of a VVB performance issue, where a VVB failure has resulted in that project denial request, we are tracking that. There are multiple reasons for why a project request could be denied. It often will, be a VVB rule violation. It could be that the project document quality is poor, incorrect, or incomplete, or that findings remain unresolved after 3 rounds of review, or that there's no response from the VVB within 60 days. We recognize that sometimes the VVB is not able to respond because the project proponent hasn't been able to provide the required information to respond. So we are cognizant of the fact that not everything means it's a project denial doesn't automatically mean it's a VVB issue, but in cases where it is clearly VVB related, we will be adding that into our performance monitoring. Just pointing out here where Vera previously issued findings during a project review related to poor quality documentation. For example, the project design document is missing information required in the PD template instructions, and or the VVB is not checking that the required information was included. That is a scenario that is now more likely to result in the project request being denied. So again, as stated, other reasons for denial are VVB rule violations, and just pointing out here that when projects are submitted and the project reviewers do detect that the project design documents missing information and or the validation and verification reports are missing information or considered poor quality, these are more often now being denied upfront, and project proponents have to wait 90 days before resubmitting the request. So the impact here for VVBs is clear that project proponents are going to be suffering much longer delays when VVBs do not during their audit detect issues with project proponent documentation, and or when the VVBs submit poor quality validation verification reports. And then of course, VVBs will be subject to potential sanctions, warnings, non-conformity reports, etc. If there's continued submission of poor quality validation and verification reports, or VVBs continue to fail to detect shortcomings in the actual project proponent documentation before finalizing the validation and verification reports. Okay, next slide, back to Anna.
Thanks, Janice. So we've also updated the loss event reporting procedure. So we've clarified that projects that do not submit a loss event report within 2 years are not eligible to issue further VCUs until the report is submitted. That's changed. We've also now specified that loss event reports must be verified by a VVB at the subsequent verification after a loss. The threshold for reporting a loss event is cumulative loss of more than 5% of previously verified ERRs. And if a loss is discovered during verification, the project proponent must submit a loss event report before the verification approval can be requested. Turn it back to you, Janice.
Great, thanks. So this is just recapping what you've said quite succinctly. If there's been a loss event caught before the next verification, then the VVB will verify that at the next verification. So that's, there's been a verification, the project proponent determines there's a loss event after that verification is done and submits a loss report, which will be verified at the subsequent verification. The important thing that Anna pointed out here is that if there's a loss event detected during an ongoing audit, it could be that it's discovered, for example, in the field, the VVB notices that there's a part of the forest has burned down and that wasn't submitted in the loss event prior to the audit. The VVB would need to issue a finding to the project proponent as part of the audit that there was a loss event, and a loss event report will need to be completed prior to the end of the verification period. And the VVB has to make sure that that finding's closed, they've reviewed the loss report event, they've audited it, and it's included as part of the verification before the project before the project proponent can submit the verification request. Over to you, Anna, for the next slide.
Thanks, Janice. So we've made 2 slight updates related to baseline reassessment. First is we've clarified what documents must be submitted and reviewed at baseline reassessment, including the specification to the specific sections of the documents. This is just in addition to the regularly required, which is included in section 424 of the registration and issuance process. We also clarified that baseline reassessment is required to reactivate an already registered project that is now inactive. Passing it back over to you, Janice.
Great. So what does this mean for VVBs? VVBs must ensure that they audit a revised version of the PD And that includes revisions to the following sections that I've highlighted here: 1.14, 1.15, 1.16, 3.1, 3.2, 3.4, 4.1 through 4.4, and 5.1.2. So the PD needs to be updated. These sections must reflect any changes as required in accordance with the baseline assessment requirements set out in the VCS standard. And any updates in the baseline emission and quantifications need to be updated in the report. The verification report also needs to include a full assessment of the baseline, obviously, in section 3.4 of the template. And when auditing an inactive project that wishes to become reactivated, a baseline assessment must take place. And the VVB must ensure that the project applied the latest version of the applicable methodology and VCS program rules in order to conduct the baseline reassessment. Next slide. Okay, I think we're going to the effective January 1st dates now for the updates for the effective January 1st. And I believe the first slide, my colleague Candace is going to present.
Yeah, so we've updated our minimum project longevity to 40 years. This was in response to ICBCM requirements. So projects with accrediting periods longer than 40 years, this change is obviously less impactful because monitoring and compensation is a requirement to continue crediting. But the update ensures that projects with a crediting period of less than 40 years still need to monitor and compensate for a minimum of 40 years. And this includes situations where an instance leaves a grouped project before the project longevity is reached. And monitoring could be done by the project, or it may also be done by Vera through our long-term monitoring system, which is currently in development, if we agree to do so with the project. But I guess regardless of who monitors, projects are still responsible for compensating the buffer if an avoidable reversal occurs. And then this update is effective for all projects requesting registration on or after January 1st of next year. This has changed since we did the original stakeholder webinar, and it basically means that existing projects can continue to have a longevity of 30 years, but they will not be eligible for the core carbon principles label if they choose to do so. I think, Janice, it's back over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Candace. So what does this mean for VVBs? In short, it means that the VVB needs to ensure that project proponents have a financial monitoring and a management plan in place for the full project longevity. So the monitoring plan part here is really important to focus on. The plan may state that monitoring will be Vera-led in the post-crediting period if the project proponent has evidence that this has been agreed to with Vera. So in reality, a project proponent would need to sign an agreement. Vera would need to agree to take over monitoring of that period. And so a VVB would need to make sure that they have the monitoring plan. And if they state that, Vera is going to be taking over monitoring at year 20, the VVBs would need to ensure that that agreement is in place with Vera. So that would be an evidence they would need to see. If an instance leaves a group project or a non-group project with multiple activity instances, the project proponent has conservatively assumed a loss of all previously verified reduction and removals associated with that instance, or continue to monitor the instance for a minimum of the remainder of the project longevity. And as I stated here, the PP would need to have that signed agreement with Vera committing them to compensate the buffer for avoidable reversals for the project longevity. Back to you, Candace, for the next slide.
Yeah, great, thanks. So then the next thing I wanted to speak about is that a new version of the AFLU non-permanence risk tool has been released. The update includes several changes. For example, the tool now incorporates future climate change impacts and sea level rise. It has additional agriculture-specific risk factors and associated mitigation measures. The minimum withholding has also increased to 12%, and it's not listed on the slide, but negative scores are no longer allowed in any sections. We also added withholdings for jurisdictions with a history of government intervention and projects that have previously failed to submit a loss report on time, so that's within 2 years. Adaptive management plans are now a requirement, and this is also in response to ICBCM requirements. And we remove the stakeholder engagement mitigation measure because it's now an expectation in the standard as a result of some of the changes that were made there. And then, as previously mentioned, we did extend the minimum project longevity to 40 years. Also, what I think is exciting, we now have a fully digitalized non-permanence risk tool, and starting next year, projects will be required to use this new AFLU non-permanence risk assessment calculator, which will be made available on October 12th in the Vera Project Hub, and it will automate the calculation of risk scores based on the user's inputs, and will also require the users to upload all the evidence to support their selection. So everything will be centralized in one database. So this update's effective for all project requests submitted on or after January 1st, except the 40-year longevity requirement, which, as previously mentioned, is effective for projects which request registration on or after January 1st. And then, Janice, is it back to you or to Mohan now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, you first.
Yeah, to me first. Thank you. Great. So what does this mean for VVBs? It's really twofold. The update here is that there are actually 6 new risk factors that have been added to the tool. And so surrounding the complexity of these, VVBs should, review, of course, these new risk factors that they will need to audit that the VVB has addressed or assessed and input addressed in the tool. And VVBs need to ensure that the competency of audit team members responsible for assessing all the data and rationales and assumptions, justifications, et cetera, are provided by the project proponent to support the non-permanence risk rating. And then as it goes for the project hub, the process of conducting the audit of the risk tool is not changed. There's 6 new risk factors, but now it's going to be a centralized project hub where the risk tool is going to reside. So VVBs are going to need to sign up for access to the project hub. They will be granted read-only access to project's non-permanence risk assessments and all the associated evidence in the online tool. Of course, once the project owner has completed that, submitted everything. The digitized version of the non-permanence risk tool is going to be launched next month. Slated for October 12th, 2023. And Vera plans to provide an instructional video on using the AFLU non-permanence risk tool calculator. We'll recommend that VVBs watch this video for an in-depth look at the tool. What we do also have today is we have our colleague Mohan, who's going to give a brief demonstration of the digital non-permanence risk tool. So with that in mind, thank you, Mohan, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Janice. Good morning. I should be able to share my screen, right? So to share my screen, you have to stop sharing the screen. Who is controlling it?
Leo.
Okay. Let me try once again. Okay, this is good. All right. Is my screen visible?
Yes, we can see your Vera sign-in screen.
Sign-in screen. Okay, that is what we wanted. So this is, as Janice mentioned, this tool, the online digital version of the tool is available on the Vera Project Hub. So this is the sign-in screen for the Vera Project Hub. You will have your own email and password to sign in. I'm just signing in as a user. So we sign in, and then we have this tool right here. We click on the tool, and we can, as a VVB, so what happens is that you'll be able to see the assessments that you are, for the project that you are verifier for or validator for. So you'll be able to see only the submitted part of the report, not the draft. VVB will have access to only the submitted thing, and then they will have ability to view, and then view the notes and print, and copy will not be there for sure. So if we view it, so this is how it looks like. So we have all these things that are checked. that are applicable to that project that are entered by the project proponent or whoever prepared this report. And you will be able to see all the things that they have done, what all the risk factors that are applicable for that particular project. And you can also see the reasons that they have provided here on the tool. We have assembled this in terms of if you remember the report, we have the internal risk, external risk, natural risk, and then those are arranged as tabs here. And you can go through each and every tab. There is no sequential thing, anything like that, and see what they have chosen. And you can see all the scores, the risk rating at the very top. You can download the report as a PDF file and see all the things just like we see in the report right now, exactly the way it is appearing right now. So these reports are there. And what we are also working on is this will be a part of the review process, digitalization process. So once the review process is there, you will get access to these documents on the review process as well. But before that, you will be able to see the read-only version of this document. So basically, the most important thing is the risk rating and the number of credits to be deposited in the buffer pool account. I think that is what VVBs are most interested in. The second thing that they are interested in is to look at the reasons and also the documents. Now, what we have done is for all these submitted ones, so there is two views. One is the notes view. In the notes view, you can see all these regions for the selections as a region as a separate thing. So you will see, okay, if this is the case, if that is the reason, if that reason is sufficient or not. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, if I click on the attachments, now this attachment is going to give me all the files, all the supporting documents that has been attached for this particular risk rating as a zip file. So you'll have access to these as a single zip folder as well. So as I mentioned, VVBs will have access to only the risk assessment that they are supposed to access for, or one of the projects that they are associated with, and they will only have a read-only access to all these documents and all the risk assessment that is done for the particular project. So that is what we have done. And then going forward, the same thing will be available on the review itself. So this is the dashboard that VVBs will be able to see. That is all from my side.
Thank you so much, Mohan.
Thank you, Leah. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mohan. I appreciate your inputs. We will then proceed to the updates that are effective as of the 1st of March 2024, and I hand over to Anna.
Thanks, Leo. So first, we're going to touch on the revised project templates. We've updated the templates for consistency, usability, and streamlined the way that information is to be included. We've updated the templates so that reporting directly links to the standard requirements, and there will be updated digital templates on the Vera project hub in the coming months. We've also provided additional guidance for users, as well as improved the formatting. And then we've also included additions and revisions resulting from other program updates, such as sections related to new labels and the sections related to the safeguards updates. We have strongly encouraged project proponents to switch to the new templates as soon as possible if it's clear or there is potential that the audit will take longer than 6 months, or if the audit starts closer to 1 March 2024. Where the project does switch to the new templates prior to the deadline, they must adhere to all requirements, and the VVB will need to audit the information that's been provided, even if it's not required yet, and also use the new templates. Again, this is effective 1 March 2024 for all project requests. Turn it over to Janice. Janice, I think you're on mute.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so the simple answer and what this means for VVB is that VVBs will be required to use the new templates and audit the information in the new templates for all program documents at the effective date or earlier. But I am going to take this this opportunity to point out that, you know, the program guide defines the program documents as all of the rules and requirements for the VCS program are set out in the program documents. And projects and methodologies need to meet all the applicable rules and requirements set out in the document. So the program documents is the complete suite of Vera rules. And VVBs are required to gather evidence and evaluate projects to determine conformance with the VCS program rules. So what I'm getting at here is just using this to reinforce the point that has been coming up recently, which is that VVBs do have to assess the project design document completed by the project proponent for accuracy and completeness of information. That means that the project design document has specific instructions for project proponents to follow on what information needs to be included. It's not exhaustive, but those instructions do need to be followed. And VVBs are required to check that the project design document has been filled out completely by the project proponent following the instructions. I think that pretty much covers what I want to discuss here, but the takeaway on this is that, you know, VVBs will need to use the new templates, and they need to make sure they check the dates to follow the implement the use of them. Next slide. This is for you, Nicole.
Thank you, Janice. So I'm going to briefly cover this update. We won't go into too much detail this time around because this update has been pretty substantially covered in the other webinars that we've held on the VCS program updates. In particular, if you're interested in the label that this update enables, the removals and reductions label, I recommend that you review the recording for the new VCUs label webinar that we held earlier this week, and that's available on the Vera website. In terms of the requirements themselves and what VVBs need to know about those, we have updated the VCS standard requirements to now make it a requirement that PPs must quantify and report their GHG emission reductions and carbon dioxide removals separately, where the applied methodology provides procedures and equations to do so. It doesn't say so here, but the VCS methodology requirements have also been updated. And these also require new methodologies or any revisions to methodologies before their approval from the effective date also need to be providing those procedures and equations that are necessary for PPs to be able to quantify and report their removals and reductions separately. So the templates have also been updated to facilitate this separate reporting, all of the VCS project templates. The quantification sections on all the tables have been added to allow for a separate reporting in those rows where it is needed. So we definitely recommend that you review those new templates and the instructions provided therein. We also recommend that you review the new definitions that were added related to this update in the VCS program definitions. So those are new definitions for carbon dioxide removal, GHG emissions reductions, long-term carbon pool, and short-term carbon pool. The latter two there are defined because they appear in the definitions for removal and reductions. Am I passing it over to you, Janice, for the next slide?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
So you've done a very good job of explaining already what it means for VVBs, but I'll just reiterate that VVBs must ensure that project proponents are reporting the reductions and removals separately in conformance with the applied methodology where it provides procedures and equations to do so. VVB should also be aware of methodologies which result in mixed removals and reduction mitigation outcome types, and which methodologies have been revised to provide separate equations. So you can see the VCS methodologies web pages and the mitigation outcome type label guidance, Appendix 2. And last thing for VVBs must validate and verify emission reduction and removal separately where they have been reported separately following the validation and verification report template instructions. And next slide for you, Anna.
Thanks, Janice. I apologize in advance. This is quite a few heavy slides, so I'll try to speak quickly and keep it as brief as possible. But we have made some improvements and potentially major changes, but not really ultimately that major changes to our safeguards. So the first to note is that all safeguards now apply to the whole program. All projects will be required to report on the safeguards at verification approval request as well. There will be guidance in the new templates on what is considered a validation requirement and therefore impossible for an already registered project to meet, and what is requirement that must be reported on throughout the lifetime of the project, regardless of when the project was registered. I think the biggest change to note is that we've actually separated the safeguards and stakeholder engagement requirements so that stakeholder engagement is its own set of requirements. We've included requirements. We have specified what stakeholder actually means within the VCS program. So we have removed the concept of local stakeholder and now refer to stakeholders. Stakeholder consultation must occur prior to project implementation, but this is only applicable to projects with the start date of 1 October 2023 and onward. Stakeholder engagement also now includes provisions for the timing of ongoing communication, which means consultation, again, must occur prior to implementation and then throughout the lifetime of the project prior to every verification event. There's now specific requirements for what is shared during FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, and that this process is ongoing and should be a part of the continued consultation process. Next slide, please, Leo. So we have first expanded no net harm. So what I meant at the beginning of these slides is that most of the new safeguards are not considered new information. Rather, there's specifications on what should be included as part of the no net harm assessment. For example, human trafficking occurring in the project due to project activities. That's a harm that, has been specified as part of the safeguards to now be reported on, but should be, a risk or a harm that has been evaluated previously. We've included, we've updated property rights information. So where property rights have been affected, the project proponent must include a benefit sharing plan that's accessible and agreed upon by the community. Templates are structured now so that any risk-based requirement shall include the assessment of risk of negative impacts during the lifetime of the project or monitoring period, and mitigation measures implemented to prevent the negative impacts. There are some requirements where there can be no risk, and the project proponent will have to demonstrate that the project meets these requirements and ensures that this harm or impact does not occur. As I mentioned, benefit sharing was not previously included as part of the VCS program safeguards. However, as we have strengthened requirements around property rights, such as specifying the groups which have property rights, a requirement on benefit sharing has been included. Next slide, please, Leo. So we have included further provisions on ecosystem health, including more information on identifying invasive species and the justification for the introduction of non-native species. We're requiring justification of the usage of non-native species to ensure that these species are not invasive. Where a project restores degraded ecosystems, the project shall demonstrate that the activity restores the project area to a native ecosystem type represented in the same ecoregion as the project. And we've included restrictions on non-native monocultures. in the introduction of ARR and WRC projects. However, we are going to be opening a consultation on this topic, and this section does not apply to projects with a start date prior to 1 March 2024, pending consultation. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we've also added new definitions for reference by including stakeholders, what we mean by customary rights holders, indigenous peoples, ecosystem conversion, invasive species, to name a few. And we are also adding new definitions for reference by stakeholders, project proponents, and VVBs. All right, turning it over to you, Janice.
Great. Thank you, Anna. So, what does this mean for VVBs? This means that VVBs need to assess the safeguards as applicable to the whole program. And VVBs must assess project conformance with the requirements. That stakeholder consultation occurred prior to project implementation. So this is, pointing out it's not prior to validation, but to project implementation. So any activities that are effectively considered the implementation, the project start date, the consultation needs to occur before then. VVBs must assess that the project proponent shared the specifically required information during FPIC. VVBs must assess that project meet the requirements for FPIC, and that is an ongoing process. VVBs need to assess that the project proponents are correctly meeting the specifications of what is included in no net harm. VVBs must assess project determination of how the project affects property rights, and where it does, that the project proponent is meeting the requirements for benefit sharing plans. VVBs must assess the project related to further provisions on ecosystem health. VVBs must assess the project doesn't violate restrictions on non-native monocultures that are introduced in ARR and WRC projects. And we really encourage VVBs to reference the updated definitions when assessing performance. Hopefully more definitions will provide more clarity. I know I frequently would go back to definitions myself as an auditor and really drill down into the meaning of that, helping to assess conformance. So in summary, safeguards are more specific now. They're applicable to all projects. Conducting and the requirement is to conduct effective consultation prior to project implementation, which is the initiation of project activities. This is for all projects with defined project start dates of greater than October 1st, 2023. Hopefully you'll find that the more clarity now and the updates that have been added around these important safeguards is helpful. We do want to make sure to point out that it's important VVBs ensure they have staff on audit teams who are experienced and competent in assessing social safeguards and stakeholder consultation processes, and that audit teams include experts who have a strong understanding of local context and conditions and the ability to interact in local languages for these types of stakeholder meetings where you're looking at safeguards and often interviewing a variety of different stakeholders. And of course, while it's true of all findings, pointing out here that VVBs need to really make sure that they're providing clear findings in the validation and verification report of how they independently assess the project's conformance. So you have a project design document that discusses all of these safeguards and all these processes, and the VVBs need to really clarify in their validation reports who they interviewed, what documentation they looked at, where did they cross-check information that was provided by the project proponent to assess conformance in these project areas. And next slide, back to you, Anna.
Thanks, Janice. So this is part of the safeguard updates, but rather we are actually specifying what is already an ongoing internal process. So now it's formalized in both the standard and the registration issuance process. So any comments that are submitted to Vera outside the public comment period, so throughout the lifetime of the project, must be addressed within 1 year of the receipt by the project proponent. And VVBs must assess that the response to the comments is reasonable and appropriate. So any action taken on the part of the project proponent to resolve any of the comments received must be assessed by the VVB at the subsequent validation or verification.
Great. And so I think this is the last what does this mean for VVB slide. VVBs need to be assessing basically that the project proponent has adhered to all the VCS standard requirements for comments received outside of a public comment period. Project proponents, just want to note here, project proponents should, they have to address comments received while the validation or verification is ongoing. So for example, a comment received outside of the 30-day public comment period, but received while the validation is ongoing, must be addressed by the project proponent as part of the validation, and the VVB should make sure that they're assessing that comment has been addressed. Because now we're looking at, receiving comments outside of an engagement, and the succeeding VVB is going to have to assess those comments. If the succeeding VVB is not known to Vera, Vera will send the comments to the project proponent, and the project proponent will need to provide those comments and any actions taken or comment responses to the VVB. So really, what would be best practice here is that, VVBs make it part of their process, their checklist, to verify with the project proponent if there were any comments received outside of the public comment period at the current or the last validation or verification. I wouldn't, 100% rely on the project proponents to be forthcoming. You're going to need to ask, have those comments been received? What I did want to note, though, is that in version 5 of our standard, so already looking forward to the next set of updates, we do expect that verifications will be required to undergo a public comment period, which they currently don't right now under the VCS standard. And so a process for ensuring the VVBs receive the comments will be much smoother in version 5, because Vera will know who the upcoming verification body is, and we'll be able to send any comments received outside of the public comment period directly to the VVB, because we'll have knowledge of who they are. And that's oops, sorry. Yes, next slide, please. So yes, this is me. This is one last summary comment here for VVBs that I wanted to include. This is that Vera encourages VVBs to develop and implement systems to incorporate the VCS program updates into it on their end. So, there's our biannual updates. It would be really great to make sure as a VVB that you've got a system in place where you can systematically take all the updates, have them brought into your own processes to cascade the training down to auditors conducting the audits on these updates. VVBs are encouraged to develop and implement tools that ensure technical reviewers specifically can act as a really good gatekeeper to conduct specific checks that the audit teams are assessing projects to updated requirements. Technical reviewers are that last gatekeeper before the project is going to get signed off on and submitted to the project proponent. So it's the technical reviewer who can adequately and correctly assess these specific updates when they're doing the technical review, that projects have been audited in alignment with the effective dates, and that validation and verification reports clearly describe how the audit teams have assessed conformance with each requirement, especially the new requirements as well. And that documents reviewed, observations made, interviews conducted are described throughout the findings of the reports. I wanted to provide these summary comments just because as we are moving towards launching our performance monitoring program, this gives us an opportunity to reiterate that the technical reviewers or the project are the gatekeeper to make sure, is the quality of the report sufficient to avoid having a project request denied because the findings weren't clearly described. It didn't really, talk about the full suite of observations made, the documents reviewed, etc. So with that, I think that's my last set of comments, and we will move over into the Q&A, which I believe, Leo, you will be facilitating.
Thank you so much, Janice. Yes, indeed. So we thank all of attendees for a great number of questions, and I see some of them have been answered already with responses being given in text. There's a number of questions which are still remaining. We'll go through them as we indicated earlier on. We have an upvote function so we can encourage attendees to vote for questions that they would like addressed as a matter of priority. So Janice, the first question says, does VVB need to visit every verification period? And I see you would like to answer this question.
Yes, so I can answer that. Yes. I think it's important here to confirm or to clarify the definition of, I guess, like the site visit. So every verification needs an audit. What we consider an audit is called the site visit. So the site visit is an audit, and yes, every verification period needs a verification audit. So yes, every verification needs a site visit. What is not necessarily required at every site visit is a site visit to the project area and or the facilities. So every verification, there has to be a verification audit / site visit. It will be up to the VVB to assess if they can provide a reason, conduct the site visit audit with a reasonable level of assurance without visiting facilities or the project area. So our rules around site visit requirements are clearly outlined in the standard. They talk about when a site visit is required and when a site visit with visits to the project area and facilities are required. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Janice. The next open question says, if the FPIC process is started in January 2023 and completed throughout 2023, can the crediting period start in January 2023? Anna, can I pass this to you?
Yes, so this is a great question. The answer would be if the FPIC process is considered the start of project activities, then the crediting period can start in January 2023. The crediting period start and project start date have specific definitions under the VCS program, but likely the FPIC process is not the beginning of project activities, as it is, again, that initial consultation with project before a project activities are implemented. So it depends on the project and it depends on the project start date.
Thank you so much, Anna. Janice, the next one we're going to hand over to you. It says, should projects be demanded to include site visit costs in their project finance, even though a site visit is not always demanded? So this links to your previous question, Janice.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. I do know, if you're looking at a project and you're assessing the project finance, they would want to be including, yes, all of the costs of the ongoing audits of a project as part of the cost of the audit that would demonstrate the need for finance itself. I don't think that a VVB can demand anything, but what they do need to do is they need to recognize that in anticipating the costs over the life of the project for the validation audits, for the crediting period renewal audits, for baseline reassessments, if that's going to take, and depending on how long the project longevity is, a reasonable estimate of costs should be included. The project proponent is not going to know at the start of the audit which VVBs are going to be conducting the audits, when a VVB is going to be able to decide if a site visit is required or not. And every VVB may make a different decision about whether they feel they can conduct a verification without going to visit a site, facility, or a project area to a reasonable level of assurance. So in short, there's a high level of uncertainty. It's impossible to predict the VVBs in the future that are going to do the verification audits or the revalidation audits, the baseline reassessment, the crediting period renewals, and making an assumption that that could all be done on site without site visits, I think would be not conservative. And I think that is what a VVB would want to be considering when they're doing the initial validation, I guess, looking at the project finance.
Thank you, Janice. While you're on the stage, can I bother you with another question? We've got a question which says, when would the field visit be required? At which stage would it be required? So when is a field visit conducted and in which stage?
I'm not sure about in which stage, what that means, but the VCS program rules clearly outline when a site visit that includes a visit to project facilities or project areas is required. A site visit that includes a visit to project areas or facilities is always required at initial validation, at crediting period renewal. But VVBs need to check the project or check the VCS rules to make sure that they are following the most up-to-date version of the rules. They could be updated in future versions.
Perfect. Thank you, Janice. The next question, Anna, it says, can the VVB perform RCP and first verification in a single joint validation and verification using joint validation and verification report templates? Or we have to do RCP and verification separately?
That's
Anna,
a good
would you like to take
question.
that? Thank you.
Sure, yep, that's a great question. So the answer is yes. It's also possible for if a VVB is doing the verification of the last monitoring period and then the renewal of the crediting period, it's also possible to use that joint template at that time.
Thank you, Anna. And while you're on the stage, can we give you another one? The next question says, does Safeguard require to provide EIA, HSIA, including monitoring plan? So it's around EIA, HSIA as well.
Great question. Yes, technically, the new safeguards and the templates actually specify what needs to be evaluated as part of risks to stakeholders in the environment, including harm to women and girls, harm to minorities, workers' rights, et cetera, and then any risks due to pollution, whether that be runoff or chemical pollution, as well as noise and or sound pollution. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. There's another one, Anna, for you as well. It says, does Vera have an IFPIC standard or procedure to follow for the project proponent and when to administer the IFPIC?
Yes, this is a great question as well. So the standard actually includes links to resources for FPIC. So the project proponent and the VVB have access to those resources. It's also, I've also recommended previously and will recommend to look at the CCB standard and the SD-VISTA standard. They may have additional resources, but the resources referenced in the VCS standard did come from the CCB standard. In terms of when to administer FPIC, as I mentioned, FPIC must be done as part of initial consultation, and it is an ongoing part of the consultation process. So getting consent to consultation and participate in the project and land use should be continued throughout the life of the project. So FPIC should not be something that's done once and then that's it. Every consultation, so prior to every verification, FPIC should be part of that process.
Thank you, Anna. The next question, which has been upvoted, Janice, I see would like to answer it. It speaks about the speed up, how to speed up the accreditation process of the VVB. It sounds like all the authorized body or accreditation body will take almost 1 year. Some need site assessments for every sectorial scope. Is there some fast track by Vera?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Unfortunately, this is something that, is outside of our scope to be able to comment on because we are, we're Vera and the accreditation bodies are independent bodies that have their own processes and their own, that they have to follow for IAF to be an IAF accreditation body. So it's completely out of Vera's control how fast that assessment process is going to take to become accredited through an external accreditation body. However, if there's some context here that I'm lacking or information that you want to take this question up further, please reach out via the auditing email and we'll try to make sure that we answer that question in more detail if I'm missing something there.
Thank you so much, Janice. And just to recap, the auditing and accreditation email address is auditing@vera.org. The next question, in order as they appear, is Anna, I see you would like to respond to it, and it asks, do these updated requirements require VVBs to employ multilingual staff in order to effectively communicate with stakeholders during site visits where regional languages are spoken, or may a translator be hired by the VVB? Anna?
Yeah, thank you, Leo. Great question. So it has always been a requirement that the management team should have the capacity to do all parts of the audit. So for stakeholder engagement, there should always be someone either on staff at the VVB or a translator or someone contracted by the VVB to be able to work with the communities and engage with the communities and speak to the communities should they not speak the same language. So that's actually not a new requirement. And yes, the VVB could hire a translator, could consult with a local expert, but it has always been required that VVBs must have some capacity on the team that is performing the audit to do all parts of the audit, including communicating with stakeholders.
Indeed, thank you, Anna. Anna, while you're there, there's another one I see you've indicated you'd like to respond to as well. It says, considering project comments, is it appropriate for a VVB to section 6 another VVB for errors found in previous validation or verifications?
Great question. So Vera conducts a Section 6 review, not the VVB. Considering project comments, if a VVB does find an error in a previous validation or verification, the VVB should notify Vera. Vera will then review the error or comment received and determine whether or not a Section 6 is appropriate.
Absolutely, thank you. We're going to jump to the last one here. There isn't anybody nominated to respond to it. It says, does HCV, high conservation value, is it integrated into the Vera updates, whether high conservation value assessment is required, and if yes, what element is needed? Thanks. I'm wondering, Justin, perhaps if you're there.
Actually, Leo, I can answer this.
Oh, perfect. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yep. So the high conservation value is a concept under the CCB program, and it is not a concept under the VCS program. However, there are requirements in the new safeguards that specify demonstrating, assessing risk to and demonstrating mitigation of said risk to any endangered, threatened species or like areas within the project area due to project activities.
Thank you so much, Anna. That brings us to an end of the open questions that we had. Actually, we've got one that has just popped in now, so perhaps we can address this one quickly. Any other questions that may arise, we do welcome you to send them to the specific email addresses that have been provided. At the end of this presentation, on the last slide, I will then provide the email addresses again that you can direct your questions to the appropriate inbox. Janice, you would like to respond to this last question. It says, with the 60-day threshold associated with PRR responses, does Vera have a standard response time to address clarification questions related to the PRRs? Janice?
Thank you. I've unmuted myself. I'll do my best here. This is a process that's outlined and has been updated in the RIP. And I believe that the RIP actually does not include specific timelines. What we would want to point out, though, however, is that the project hub that has been launched is a very effective tool that has been set up to specifically allow project proponents and VVBs to see exactly what the status of the project is, where it is along the pathway, and that will give updates in terms of number of days it's been in each status, whether it's outstanding and the number of days it's outstanding with the VVB, or whether it's been reviewed and the project review is done and it's waiting for a final decision by the decision maker internally at Vera. So I don't believe that there's a standard published time. You can consult the RIP, but the Project Hub tool has been launched to specifically provide transparency around the status of projects and where each one is at.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you once again for all the questions. I'd like to take this opportunity while I have you here, all the VVBs, to just inform you of the next upcoming webinar, which is scheduled for the 17th of October. And the topic for that webinar is going to be covering our jurisdictional and nested RED JNR, as well as the food loss waste methodologies. So we would encourage all VVBs to register for that as well. The invites will be sent out shortly. However, There is the QR code which you can scan at this point as well. It's will take you to the registration page for the next upcoming webinar. So we'll give you a moment or two for those that are interested to scan the QR code. As indicated, we will also be sending out an email invite to our VVB contacts to also participate. That being said, I would like to thank all our presenters, firstly, for a great job in presenting, and also to all the VVBs for your keen participation, the questions that were posed. Thank you so much. As indicated, here is again the email addresses for specific questions. So questions that are pertaining to the VCS program updates, please send them to programupdates@vera.org. And then more general questions pertaining to the VCS program can be sent to info@vera.org. And then questions that are pertaining specifically to the auditing and accreditation function can be sent to auditing@vera.org. We thank you so much for your participation, and we wish you all a wonderful day further. Thank you.